Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Royal Irish Academy of Music online guest lecture. It's a great pleasure to introduce Adrian LeHarivel, Curator of British Art at the National Gallery of Ireland, who will be presenting a lecture entitled Getting Plucked, a Guide to Historic Keyboard Instruments. Adrian LeHarivel studied art history at the University of Edinburgh and has spent his career at the National Gallery of Ireland. He was initially curator of the permanent collection and worked on all areas covering 7 centuries, including Irish art. He has contributed to many catalogues and exhibitions, mounted numerous displays, and has written for and edited catalogues of new acquisitions. In 1982, he set up the Prints and Drawings Department and produced the first modern summary catalogues in 1983 and 1988. He was closely involved in the 2017 rehang of continental and British art in the refurbished building, including the Italian, Spanish and Grand galleries. His specialties are 18th century culture, art, religious art, architecture and collecting. He has also been researching and lecturing on the links between art and music over the last 20 years. His next exhibition is Pastel Revealed, a survey of 400 years, which will run from February to May 2023. He has previously lectured on opera, orchestra and musical paintings for the Royal Irish Academy of Music, and we are delighted to have Adrian with us today to present this guest lecture entitled Getting Plucked, a Guide to Historic Keyboard Instruments. Thank you, Adrian.
Well, lovely to be with you, and I thought, given the rise of interest in creating period performance, getting away from everything being accompanied by a Steinway, that it might be interesting just to look, and instructive to look at the different types of early instrument, not all of which can be played anymore, and many of which are really art objects today, but very close and hence easily confused, particularly since the makers tended to go their own ways. I've sort of laid out the menus, you might say, here. You'll be seeing all these a little later. The 4 major types of plucked instrument, unlike the hammer used for the piano. I'm going way back to the 15th century because there's this fascinating drawing by Henri that seems to present a 35 key instrument that looks rather like a harpsichord. It has 5 roses, in fact, but one wonders whether anything like this was actually being made at the time. He's much more concerned with the mathematics of proportions, as always been a concern for a lot of musicians, this being descended from the medieval psaltery, is the hand-held and hand-plucked instrument, and having no dampers, it suggests that some sort of rather bright ringing sound was intended, which would be very different from the sort of instruments that we're used to today. We do have a 3-dimensional drawing from the 16th century, from this book in Weimar, full title, the Weimarer Ingenieurer Kunst und Wunderbuch. And you can see here we have the harpsichord on the table, reminded that the early harpsichord came out of its case and might not even have a stand. Here you can see they're just using the kitchen table. But although, again, it's a very generalized representation, it gives you some idea of where things were heading at the time. This is the earliest surviving harpsichord, 1521. It's in the Victorian Albert Museum in London. It has faded a little, the exterior decoration, and you can just see, if you look on the right-hand side, that the harpsichord actually is separated from the case, so you can lift it out. Made of cypress wood. In Rome, for all the name of this rather mysterious figure, Jerome of Bologna, he seems to have worked around probably the papal court. Leo X was a great music enthusiast, And although there's very little inside, at least you've got the sort of the structure left. This very similar type, Guido Trasantino is a more solid figure. He's one of the first of the great Venetian makers. And again, you can see this very beautiful decoration on the outside of the case, abstract, and starting to ornament around the key well, ivory and ebony being used for the naturals and the vats, and even little sort of studding in ivory around the top. As I say, a lot of these instruments really become as interesting for the decoration as for the music side. Another example from the Vienna, 1574, amazing survival. First, you're seeing that actually it's got its case still, and this lovely painted decoration inside. Apollo and the Muses are right in the center. The maker, Giovanni Antonio Baffo, was working for about a decade, as far as we know, but like many of the early manufacturers, has left very little sort of information behind him. In our own collection, just to show you someone actually playing an instrument, even if it's in painted form, St. Cecilia by Jacopo Vignali, done about 1600. And here you see the full impact of an instrument when it was in prime condition, with also the paint there and these cheek ends to the keyboard here, these sort of cheek pieces, the lovely decorative pieces you often find in the early harpsichords. This is the whole painting. See, there's lute and singing going on as well. And on the table there, we've actually got the key to the instrument. Stunning instrument. This is one of a number you're going to see from the Fenton House collection in Hampstead. The National Trust own the house, and the idea is that nearly everything is in working order. So this actually still plays. It's one instrument from the 16th century that has never actually been made over or extended. And obviously you have to repair and replace some of the strings and other small parts. But in fact, it is a really good representation of a deep-toned instrument at the time. It did get changed slightly. In the 17th century, the lid was painted, and the drop board there at the front, but it is in sort of fairly good order, and although replaced, sort of you can see something of the design, at least, of the original stand that you find on many of these 16th century instruments. Just coming in for a detail there. We don't know who made this. It's thought to be from Venice around 1590, but it's a magnificent instrument still. Sometimes you go to unusual sources. Giovanni Celestini was quite an important maker of the late sort of 16th century, and not many instruments survive. One turns up being played by the young Mozart when he's on one of his early trips to Italy. And in his portrait that was last seen at auction, it's very clearly inscribed as by him. The date is on the harpsichord. Here you actually see an instrument. Just ignore the 18th century stand underneath and sort of focus on the main instrument. You can see something not too dissimilar to the one in the Mozart portrait, and obviously he's playing contemporary music. And it's a reminder often that in fact you don't just have to play music of the time, which might be quite limited, particularly with the early instruments, that often later pieces can sound really effective on some of the early keyboards. Celestini was making harpsichords in Venice in the 1580s, but he's also making spinets and virginals. So remind also that these makers could be quite diverse. There are 4 dated harpsichords by him, and one we just briefly saw is in Hamburg, dated 1608. So this is one of his later examples. The name everyone knows is the Rookers family of Antwerp, and there are 2 camps. There are those who enthuse about their instruments, and hence the large number of replicas made, and others who point to the rather substandard manufacture of a lot of them. They were just very good publicists, and there were an awful lot of them. They start off Hans Rookers I, you might expect, who's working from about the 1570s, and then there's about 4 generations. You've got his son Hans, and then you've got Andreas, and then there's the nephew, the Couchet, who joins, and there's Johannes, we'll be seeing a few instruments by, and they had a big market in Antwerp. They were widely collected, bought in France. The great sort of intellectual musician, really polymath, Constantine Huygens in Holland actually wrote to a merchant he knew in Antwerp to arrange the purchase of an instrument from the family. And between them, they were producing about 26 harpsichords a year, plus a range of other instruments, particularly virginals. This one, again, you have to sort of avoid the distractions, shall we say, of a slightly later standard. It's the 17th century it's on, and it was also given what the French rather charmingly call this révalement. This is when, as these instruments endured and music changed, they needed to be extended to actually keep up with what was happening. And so in France, it became a real business. A whole sort of specialist number of musical manufacturers doing it. The best known name from the 18th century, Pascal Joseph Tasquin, and he actually altered this double manual instrument. Here we actually see the Johannes from the 2nd generation with this magnificent 1612 harpsichords in the royal collection. It's been cleaned up, but it is actually a genuine instrument. And on the soundboard at the back there, you can just see some of the typical floral decoration, and there's an elaborate decorated rose, a sound hole, very typical of the Rookers decoration, but also, of course, the papers. They had these printed papers that they particularly used, and some others also in Antwerp, and they are very much a feature of the keywell that you see. This one was slightly altered and still seems to be in playable condition. I haven't actually heard it. The home of the great George Friedrich Handel on Brook Street in Mayfair is a museum. Currently it's having a major overhaul. They've finally taken possession of the ground floor, which they're going to restore how it looked when you could go there and sort of buy your tickets from the parlor at the front. But upstairs, the rooms have survived intact. And this is the main room. This is where Handel literally rehearsed his singers and musicians and put on little performances after dinner. And in times when the museum is opened, once a week they have evening concerts and other events. Only 28 people can get in this room. You know, this is a Georgian house, but it's amazing you can actually recapture the atmosphere of being in somewhere where we know music was being played, and they have a copy of that royal instrument, as you can see here. They've since acquired a fine 18th century harpsichord as well, so this is not given such a prominent position, but it has been in use for many years. The Rookers type, I say, very favoured abroad, and here we are in Holland, Jan Steen, this woman playing the harpsichord to a man, 1659, and seeing some of the features. Here we've got everything is intact, the lid with this sort of folding section to cover the keyboard, the drop board, and then coming into the keyboard itself. I'm afraid we don't get the manufacturer's name. It's just Stein decided to sign it himself. The dolphin paper is one of the favorite types of the Ruckers family. And here we have a modern replica of that type, Titus Kleinen. Not to decry these, I mean, they do mean that you can get some idea of what sound, you know, a lot of care and time goes into researching these instruments and bringing back, as far as you can, something of the original sound. And of course, although these instruments are incredibly finicky, the tuning is even sometimes in mid-performance. If it's a long oratorio, you have to constantly watch them, but they are wonderful to hear. This is another example from a Johannes Ruckers type, one that actually belongs to Aidan Scanlon of Limerick. He brings up to Dublin for a lot of concerts, so you will see it around. And yet again, this happens to belong to the Irish Baroque Orchestra, the IBO. So again, it's this instrument you will see around town, and it's quite typical of a lot of replicas that you don't get much decoration. You do often get these inscriptions that are all about sort of, music here, banishing care, and these are again a feature of the Ruckers instruments. Here we have Andreas the first, who is the brother of the son of the first Hans. You see, it's a very internecine little family, and this is at Yale. Not playable, but it does give you again a sense of the original instrument. It just shows you, of course, that they do weather and they lose something of the brilliance that they once had, even though they're still quite magnificent. Here's Jan Johannes Couchet, who's the nephew of the Johannes we were just looking at, and this is a very fine instrument in Paris, which is heavily ornamented in sort of the French fashion. They loved richness. This is the time of Louis XIV, and hence the landscape inside the lid, and then all this sort of decorative work on gold on the outside, and this beautiful Baroque stand that it's on. Malcolm Proud, now in his sort of 70s, but he was one of the great pioneer period performers in Ireland, and he has something based on Johannes Ruckers, but also plays, when he's at National Concert Hall, the instrument they bought, not from the 17th century source, but after Pierre d'Anzelag, who's a very highly regarded early 18th century maker, and both these have a particularly nice tone. Now, I thought if it works, we might have a little brief musical interlude, and I'm going to play you a number of pieces. First of all, that music, the instrument that we had from the Fenton collection, the Venetian one. You can just go back. Here we go. As I was saying, it's got a really wonderful tone, and surprisingly deep for that early period. And then next we have Malcolm himself actually playing, not on this particular instrument, on the Christopher Dobbs version of a 17th century instrument. And this is a little bit of Purcell. by the 19th century, harpsichord playing had almost disappeared, and then there was a sort of revival sort of later in the century. But it wasn't really until the 20th century that it started coming back into the mainstream, and one of the great figures is van der Landauska, you see here, the Pole who settled in Paris, who didn't have original instruments. She had what were being made in the people thought in the style of the originals, but the research was really in its infancy. And although today her playing is a little heavy, the sound quality obviously of early recordings is not perfect, but you get some sense of how they're really being treated much more like pianos. And we should have here a little bit of J.S. Bach. Sadly, when the Germans invaded France, she had to flee, left everything behind her. So her scores and her instruments were all destroyed. But through recording, she remains a great figure in the revival of interest in the harpsichord. We haven't left the 17th century because there are figures who didn't just have a sort of a manufacturing reputation, but actually sort of really at the courts of Europe. And the key figure is Girolamo Zenti. His instruments are incredibly rare. There are only two harpsichords surviving. One is in the Met in New York, which has an incredible collection of musical instruments. And I can tell you that he was started in Rome. He came from Naples originally. He worked for Medici in Florence, Charles I in London, Louis XIV, and then back to Viterbo for Pope Innocent X, and back to Paris, where he probably died in this very year, 1666. There's some 20 instruments that may be by him. This one of the only two with any certainty. But it shows you the style in Italy continuing in these very, very solid instruments with the decoration generally sort of ornamental rather than having sort of illustrative panels or sort of subject painting. And you can see a very, very solid looking stand. This I have to say I haven't quite pinned down because it's another IBO instrument. I thought it was worth including. It seems to be based on 17th century instrument, but it has a very good tone, and Peter Whelan generally is seen playing it, leaping from his chair. He's a great enthusiast. Very different from the continuing French tradition. They really did love their ornament in France, and Claude Jacquet was a maker who has left this one very fine instrument. It's migrated to America now from 1652. The support from the King, Louis XIV, meant that there was a great interest in France, hence the amount of composing that's going on, and it sort of leads obviously to the creation of more instruments. Here we have Tascin, as we jump again to the 18th century. And the other side of his character, of course, was that he knew there was a market for Flemish instruments. So he started making fakes. And here we have a sort of a hybrid with sort of japanned decoration in lacquer, which is very fashionable in the 18th century. But the case itself is ornamented and decorated inside as if it's a Rooker's. And he was also making fake couchés, very much to sort of satisfy the market of the time. Here we have another collection I wanted to highlight. The University of Edinburgh actually has a magnificent working collection again, like Fenton House. And in the St. Cecilia Museum, which is housed adjacent to the 18th century concert hall that was opened in Edinburgh. They have as many as possible of instruments from the 16th to the early 19th century kept in working order, and a real joy to visit there and actually hear them, because they use them in concerts as well. This is Mr. Tasquin again, with another of these sort of what looks a bit like a 17th century instrument, but actually is all actually by him. Oh, sorry, another view of the Jackie there. There you go. The Germans also play an important role. Hamburg is the city of Hieronymus Hass, and a lot of these were exported even over here to Dublin. This is just one example. They tended to go for the undecorated exterior case and then the decorated lids. As you see here, this is the instrument collection in Brussels. And also from the 18th century, Johannes Dulken has a very high reputation. We're now very much into the 18th century style with some of these sort of cabriole legs and sort of ornamentation on the outside. And there is such a profusion of makers that one can't really sort of cover them in a brief survey, but it's certainly a high period for the creation and obviously the playing of harpsichords. This I put in because it's a little anonymous drawing that shows a group of musicians around the harpsichord, and in fact this is highly likely to be a Dulken. It's very close to what we were just looking at, and it's got another of these rather delightful little sort of moral phrases, many of which come from antiquity and great writers, and basically advising you keep quiet if you want to live in peace. Here we have, in fact, one that was is a replica of a Dulken, a modern version, with some elaboration. You can see the ornamentation on the outside, and also this sort of a sort of pastiche Claude Lorrain landscape that's been painted inside the lid. In our own collection, a good introduction to the British tradition is shown by the William Hogarth painting here of the Weston family. He's an Essex landowner. He wants to show off his sort of obviously his sophistication. So he's got a nice harpsichord in the back of his room, and they're having tea off a silver table with a Chinese porcelain set of cups. In the background, say, is the harpsichord, which looks rather plain after the continental examples, but it's very typical of what happens in London. From the early 18th century, there was a liking for woods, often with inlays, beautifully chosen woods, but keeping the decorative ornamentation, such as we've seen, away. Again, you get these sort of dynasties of makers. We seem to have lost Mr. Tusher. I'm sorry about that. I was hoping to show you that there's a portrait of Burkett Schudy, maker in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And he is a key figure. Hermann Tabel, German, went to London. He had two main apprentices. One is Burkett Schudy, and the other is John Broadwood. Of course, you probably better know as a piano maker later. And Schudy and Broadwood got together as a partnership for a time, and produced a number, first harpsichords, and then Broadwood, as I say, takes up pianos. And this is a fine example of an instrument that's again at Fenton House, and hopefully The music there was Carl Abel, so very appropriate London music. What's particularly interesting, of course, is that there was suddenly a development of what we call novelty features, particularly the lute stop, which gave you that much more gentle sound we had in the middle passage of the overture by Abel we were just listening to. And these sort of gimmicks, we start seeing pedals arriving to again to change the sort of dynamic of playing. Very much are reactions to the arrival of the piano. 1772, America's Bacchus instrument that is today in the St. Cecilia Hall collection on loan from the Duke of Wellington, and the harpsichord makers obviously felt they had to compete. Apart from that, what I was saying about the cases, these lovely inlays, generally mahogany cases, and then you find sort of worn out satin wood and other fine woods being applied. So there is a lovely sheen and finish to these instruments, but very different from what's happening on the continent. I know you love technical details, so we just happen to have a cross section here. This is a double manual, and on the right-hand side, you can see the little jacks which spring up to pluck the strings, and there's a reflection of the amount of research that now goes into these instruments, exactly how they work, and particularly for making replicas. An important firm of Longman and Broderick. I put their trade label up because I wanted to sort of draw your attention to the fact again that one shouldn't sort of try and particularize too much about makers and one type of instrument, because they, as you can see, were manufacturing, repairing, and selling, of course, organs, pianofortes, harpsichords, spinets, violins, guitars, etc., etc. So you went to a sort of a shop, you would find a whole lot of different things actually on sale. This is an instrument by them. Sorry, I didn't get black and white. Again, from the Fenton House collection. It was quite a brief partnership from 1775 onwards for about 10 years. And just to highlight another of these great dynasties, Jacob Kirkman came from Strasbourg originally, and he took over the business of Hermann Tarbell. He married his widow, a way rather like sort of getting an organ post in the 18th century, sort of marrying into the manufacturing business, was a way of getting a leg up. And about 105 harpsichords survived by his family firm, to wit, nephew Abraham Kirkman, great nephew Joseph Kirkman II. So they had quite a long existence. So this one example is in the V&A. I said I put in some oddities. I'm highlighting one, in fact. You've seen an instrument with a lute stop, but they also tried to actually combine literally the lute and the harpsichord together. This design here we see recreated rather strange instrument. Bach was very keen on this, and it does seem to have had one, so it wasn't an aberration. It did exist, and you do find these sort of variety of different instruments. So moving on to the spinet, it's really actually a smaller version of the harpsichord, but more limited. And it starts off in sort of triangular form. Girolamo Zenti, we met already, sort of the international figure, produced some. And this is an example of his sort of 16th century. But he also devised the bent side spinet, with sort of the curved side, where you could actually have great space for putting in the strings, but still keeping it very tight, because obviously you're running horizontally rather than sort of in a sort of alongside the keyboard rather than away from it. The great period of the bent side spinet was in the 17th century. A marvelous account of the diarist Samuel Pepys, who goes off to buy one, and Riley notes that he preferred it to a harpsichord because it took up less room, and he also even managed to specify how much ornament there should be on his instrument. This is one of the London makers, Charles Hayward, instruments now in the V&A. The confusion often comes out because of the name. It comes out of the Italian word spinetta, but of course that was also applied to a harpsichord itself, and equally the espinet is a word that was sort of used rather sort of broadly, and so you do get quite a deal of often of confusion, but certainly no mistaking you get to this period and into the 18th century. The English seem to have particular liking for the spinet because it was again presumably quite easy to keep indoors. Here we have one of the latter makers, John Chang. Again, it's in the Met, but Thomas Hitchcock, London maker, was well known for them as well. John Harrison, Thomas Haxby, so there are quite a few makers of the time. I said to concentrate mainly on the harpsichord, so we're sort of abbreviating down the latter instruments, and we've got to number 3, the clavichord, which again you can see you've got strings going across, but sort of different way of a striking mechanism and a very different sound to it. And this is one of the earliest that survives. It's in the Musée de la Musique in Paris. For some reason, it's got this odd navel scene inside it, and no one's ever given a real explanation why. But it is a fine instrument, and also much easier to tune than the harpsichord. It had a good tone to it. Just to show someone playing, rather beautiful little painting by Gerrit Dow, showing the woman here in the interior, and we did come in. You can see how easily portable it was, and though you might think that's rather limited instrument, not a great range, it became a very useful device actually for composing on. And Bach and Handel really liked having one in the house because it was easy. It was like a sort of notepad that you could sort of rattle something off. But they also, as you can see, could be very highly decorated. I'm going finally to the virginal, which is another, like the harpsichord area, where there are actually a lot of instruments around. And I like my origins. So here we are, 1537. But in fact, way back in 1460, we get the first reference to the instrument. 1501, the court organist in Buda in Hungary was played the virginal at meals, according to an account. And in 1511, Sebastian Verdung's treatise on music, again, was tracing it back, he thought, to the hand-plucked psaltery of the Middle Ages. A very delicate tone, a name that made it associate with sort of the young sort of virgin women playing it. But in fact, it's from the Latin for rod, virga, referring to the little jacks that spring up and pluck the strings. Names again get very confused. The arpicorda in Italy, the spinetta and espinet in other places. And in England in the 16th century, virginal actually referred to any keyboard instrument. A replica of this has actually been made, and what was actually quite instructive, I talked about sort of this ravalement, was that it turned out not even to have the range to play all William Byrd pieces of the Elizabethan court. So these instruments could very quickly go out of date. Here you actually see early painting, Jan van Hemessen from 1545, where the woman is actually playing the instrument. I think the scale is a little awry, but it's lovely to have a view looking down into it. And another of the very early instruments from the Fenton collection. It's started off as the Fenton Fletcher collection, then they've added more things to it. This is by the Sicilian maker Marcus Siculus, and it's his only known instrument, dated to 1540. In Holland, there evolved a sort of tradition of actually standing at the virginal, as you can see here. This is a painting by Zorg. But generally people were sort of still sitting at this period, and they could become incredibly elaborate. Annibale Rossi here in the V&A worked in Milan. 9 of his virginals actually survive, and this is certainly the most elaborate of them. It's absolutely covered with decoration, as you can see here, and made up boxwood and ivory, 1928 precious and semi-precious stones inlaid, everything sort of turquoises to jaspers and emeralds and sapphires. And it's suggested actually it could be the clavichord, misname of course, of uncommon beauty and excellence, with the keys all of precious stones and with the most elegant ornaments, which was recorded as being sold for 500 crowns in 1619. So it's a really elaborate instrument. This is one of the instruments you can actually see very easily. There's a problem, the V&A's collection is no longer public display, and obviously a lot of places one goes to, instruments take second place. But in the V&A, because of its association with Queen Elizabeth, this virginal is kept out, and is a fine example of the late 16th century. It's probably by Benedetto Floriani of Venice. From the time of her father, Henry VIII, they were importing a lot of instruments, all types from the continent, and she continued that, and she did actually play the keyboard and the lute. The strong association to her is that it's got the arms of the Queen and Anne Boleyn, her mother, and no one else in England at this date will be putting those on an instrument. And just see this boxwood here on the keys, even little inlay on them. More typical would be a painted instrument, and this one at Fenton House is yet again Giovanni Celestini, who we met earlier, which had a rather interesting later history, because it ended up in a carpenter's workshop in Florence when it was rediscovered in the 20th century and restored to its former glory. Probably the most famous painting of a virginal is the one by Johannes Vermeer, the lady playing with a gentleman alongside her. There's a very similar instrument, not identical, in the Rijksmuseum collection. And here we see this standing position that the Dutch seem to favor, but of course you could take that instrument off its stand and just put it on a lower table. The rookers, active with virginals just as with harpsichords, and Johannes again. Here we have a fine instrument that's left, and they even devised the musular. Their way of actually offering a little extension was the known, as you might imagine, as the mother and child instruments. Both of these actually could be pulled out and played separately, and then two could actually do a duet together. And this is the first example. It's one of the finest instruments by the founding member of this great dynasty, Hans Rookers I, 1581. You'll see the location, it's in the Met again. I mean, it's just as a piece of decoration, it's just absolutely magnificent. It can't be played, but at least you can visually enjoy it. And here, Jan Molenaar showing a woman actually playing seated in this instance, and it's nice again to look inside the instrument. The British take up the type that's seen in Holland. Many of them were imported. It's very hard to actually track down makers there, but certainly we can identify quite a few in London. Robert Hackley is one of them. This is the period of Charles II, Samuel Pepys, and a great interest in the virginal with this fine ornament painted inside the lid, this sort of the drop board, and normally quite a deep tone to them. I'm ending this very, as you appreciate, brief survey with something close to home, because we do have this rather delightful Dublin virginal book, which is in Trinity College in their collection. Eamon Sweeney, the lutenist, often has recourse to it, but it also to be played on the keyboard. And it's a reminder, of course, that even the music of the time, much of it only survived in manuscript, and is lost. Any biography of the early 16th and early 17th century composers, you constant references to what has no longer survived. But it's also a reminder of a need to interpret that, as with all other instruments at the time, particularly the Baroque orchestra, that a lot was left to the player to devise. I'm ending there. We've seen 4 types of key instrument of the past. All really end up in museums this day, but if you have the opportunity to get to Edinburgh, London, and actually hear a working collection, it really does bring them back to life. So thank you very much for being with us today.